I want to share with you some wonderful stories from the country of Kenya in the western part of Africa. There are many wonderful stories from Kenya that have enriched our lives. But since we live here in the great Palmetto State, I wanted to tell you a story from Kenya that not only touched my life, but really touched my heart. And this is the story of sweetgrass baskets and how they came to the United States. Long, long ago, in a village in West Africa, in Kenya, my old-timey grandfather lived there. And child, come over here. Come to Grandma. Grandma wants to tell you, you want to know how I learned to sew? Well, let me tell you a circle tale from long, long ago. But first you must crawl up into my arms and learn about sweetgrass charms. My old-timey grandfather, he lived in this village, and he lived in a hut, a beautiful little hut, near a fine flowing river that went to the wide, deep ocean, all the way over to faraway Africa. And I had a fine, fine old-timey grandfather. He worked with the rice, he worked in the fields, and he gathered some of the beautiful tall reeds by the river. And he dried them in the sun, and he used his fingers to talk. And when they talked just right, and the rains came, his beautiful baskets would hold the water. Now in this village, the rice grew in the water. And many, many people depended on the rice to feed the families, but also to feed the spirits of the land. So my grandfather, as he grew from being a young boy, he was told, you're not a boy any longer, yet you're not a man. We will take you to the kashi bush, into the grove where the palm trees grow. And if you can answer the question right, we will give you a name, and we will teach you all we know. And then, my son, you will be a man. So my grandfather was very worried. The village men took him to the special grove, and they said, can you make a basket that will hold the rain? And my grandfather said, yes. And they said, my son, you're a man. And they took him into the forest, into the grove, and they taught him to hunt and to fish, and they taught him to take his hands and weave the grasses into baskets. They taught his hands to talk to each other, his fingers to grow together. First tying a knot, then a coil, and then a circle. And they taught my grandfather, let the circle be unbroken. One time in the middle of the night, when the rains were coming, my grandfather was so sad, his tears became so bitter because the slave man came to his village and grabbed him and took him to a ship at a port and took him to a strange new land. And my grandfather, when he opened his eyes and looked around, he was in the port of Charleston, South Carolina. He was standing at an auction block. They made my grandfather walk up on the block, and the auctioneer said, buy it high, buy it low, buy it fast, buy it slow, he must go. And a master from a huge plantation in South Carolina, where it had a beautiful river rolling along its banks, bought my grandfather and took him there and put him in a hut with cypress shingles. And he worked in the rice fields all day long. And at night he would come home, and he would take some of the sweetgrass, some of the palmetto, some of the pine, some of the marsh grass. And he would tie his knot, and he would make his coil, and the circle would go round and round, the circle unbroken. And his fingers remembered. They knew the secrets. They said, never forget Africa. And when his fingers talked together just right, he could take his baskets out. And when the rains would come, his sweetwater baskets could hold the rain. Well, on a neighboring plantation, my grandfather went over there and one day met my old-timey grandma. And she had come from faraway Africa too, where she had learned to work with the rice and work with the baskets. And in the shadow of the big master's house, that's where they were wed. And they had children and beautiful families, and they'd work in the fields of rice, and they had Moses baskets up and down the rows with the babies in the sun. And if the babies cried, old-timey grandma would go over, and with a voice that was soft like the Spanish moss and low like the flowing tide, she could soothe those babies. And through the years, night after night, after a long day in the plantation, my old-timey grandma and my old-timey grandpa would go to their home, and they would spend their time, and their fingers would talk to each other, and they would remember. They would always remember their Africa. Well, as the years went by, the water flooded the rice fields, and suddenly there was no rice. So my old-timey grandfather, he built a boat, and he went out in the water way past where the sweet marsh grows. And he fished, and he got enough fish to feed his family and enough fish to sell in the town. So he came home that night, and everyone celebrated, and he put the children all around the fire, and he told them Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox stories, and their eyes twinkled like stars in the sky, moonlight on the water, and the fire in the heart. And the next morning, my old-timey grandma, she got up, and she put the fish in the basket. She put her wares in the basket. She had made little tiny sweetgrass baskets that kept treasures that she liked, like palm oil and cola nuts and some ginger. And she headed off into Charleston. She not only carried the fish and the wares, she carried her hopes, her dreams, her cares, and her burdens, but she carried them with pride. And in the city, she sold her wares and took care of her family. Well, soon, before they knew it, a great war took place across the ocean, and all the men from the islands were taken and sent to war. And the women stayed home, and they sewed, and they waited, and they used palmetto and sweetgrass and marsh grass and pine. And they sewed, and they waited. And when the men finally came home, they brought with them men who built steel arch bridges. And they said, "Grandmama, what is it?" And I said, "Oh, child, it's tomorrow." And with the bridges came cars, and with the cars came people. And when the people came in, they wanted to change our ways. The old ways were going out, and the new ways were coming in. Oh, child, it's tomorrow. But they took everybody down to the stands at the slave market, where old-timey grandpa first came from Africa, and they sold the baskets. They set them up. And soon, the mothers and the grandmothers taught their daughters how their fingers could talk together and talk to each other. And when they talked really, really well, those coils were so tight, that knot became a coil, that coil began to be a circle, and the circle was unbroken. And I must tell you all that as the circle is unbroken, you must remember that that tie that binds it together goes way past slavery, way past freedom, way past old ways, right into new ways. And it binds us together like the sweet